Come here, sit next to me on this wooden bench that your grandfather made himself. Feel the breeze coming in through the window crack, and bring your crochet. I want to tell you a story that, if I hadn't lived it myself, would be hard to believe. It's one of those things that life throws at us without warning. One of those things that become a secret kept deep in our hearts, and that, from time to time, still wake me up in the middle of the night. And mind you, I've lived a long life. I've seen good people be born and pass away. I've seen times of prosperity and times of hardship. I've seen families break up over little things, and I've also seen people who claim to be saints hide sin behind their smiles. But nothing, absolutely nothing, hurt me as much as the disappointment I suffered at that time. Before I start, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing that my story is reaching different places. I was a woman who believed in love more than anything else in this world. I truly believed that marriage was a sacred commitment, made before God and the entire congregation. When I married your grandfather, there in the little white church on top of the hill, I was so full of hope that my heart felt like it was going to burst with joy. I remember my wedding dress, sewn by my mother's hands, with lace so delicate that I was afraid it would fall apart if I touched it. That day, the girls whispered that I was beautiful, and he, your grandfather, looked at me with eyes that shone like embers in the dark. It was there, right at the altar, that he promised me fidelity and respect, and I swore that I would be his companion until the end of my days. I believed in that promise with all my strength. It never crossed my mind that years later I would discover that it was all an illusion, and that my heart would be shattered like a plate that falls on the floor. At that time, our life was simple. We lived in a small but well-kept house, with a yard that was swept every day, a backyard full of chickens, and a wood stove that never went out. Early in the morning, I would get up before sunrise to heat up the coffee, and he would leave with his hoe on his shoulder, always so serious, always saying that he was working for our future. I was proud to have such a husband, dedicated, respected by everyone. When he came home at night, he smelled of grass and sweat, and I felt calm just seeing him arrive. It was as if nothing bad could happen while he was at home. I was so wrong, but I only understood that much later. On Sundays, we went to church together. It was a custom he never broke, and neither did I. I liked being around the other women, helping in the congregation's kitchen, while he sat up front, near the pastor. The pastor's wife, Mrs. Alzira, was a woman who knew how to make herself loved, always smiling, always ready to compliment anyone. I thought she was my friend, and maybe that's why it hurt even more. Every time I arrived to help with the cakes and breads, she would greet me with that tight hug, saying she admired me so much, and I believed her. I believed every word she said as if it were the absolute truth. I never imagined that behind that smile there was a secret that would one day hurt me in a way that no one else could fix. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Life went on at that gentle pace of those who are in no hurry. I took care of the house, he took care of the farm, and on Sundays we had Mass and then lunch with the family. It was only after a while that I began to notice some strange things. He started coming home later from meetings. When I asked him about it, he said he was helping the pastor with some church matters. I wanted to believe him, because I've always been the type who prefers to trust rather than feed mistrust. But there were times when my heart would tighten in a way that made me know something wasn't right, and that's how it was with me. One day, he came home smelling of perfume that wasn't mine, a sweet, strong scent that lingered on his clothes. I commented on it, trying not to sound angry. He looked at me with that look of someone who already had a lie ready and said it was the pastor's wife who had given him a hug before he left. I wanted to believe him. That night, I turned away in bed and cried silently, afraid that he would realize that my faith was beginning to crack. The days passed, and the situation did not improve. He made up excuses to stay at the church after everyone else had left. When I asked him about it, he got angry. He said I was being suspicious for no reason. And I, who was raised to be patient and not cause fights, kept everything to myself. My heart was heavy, but my mouth remained silent. Only God knows how much it hurt. I was afraid to ask and find out that my intuition was right. I preferred to deceive myself a little longer, pretending that it was all in my tired head. But silence is like poison. It spreads slowly, and when we realize it, it's too late. I remember the day I discovered the truth as if it were yesterday. I had gone to church in the morning to help clean the hall. In my hurry, I forgot my apron hanging on a hook near the kitchen. When I went back to get it, everything was quiet. I pushed the door open carefully because I thought no one else was there. That's when I heard a soft noise, as if someone were talking in a very low voice. And there, behind the curtain that separated the hall from the small storage room, I saw with my own eyes. Your grandfather was with Mrs. Alzira, embracing each other in a way that left no doubt. I froze. My heart was racing so fast that I thought I was going to drop dead right there. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask how they had the nerve to do that to me, but no sound came out. I could only take a step back and leave without them noticing that I had seen everything. I walked home slowly, as if my legs were made of stone. Each step felt like it was going to knock me down. When I entered the kitchen, I sat on the bench and stared at the floor, trying to understand at what point my life had turned into this lie. I thought about everything he promised me at the altar. Every word of affection he said, every time I doubted my beauty, every smile the pastor's wife gave me as she hugged me. And that's when I understood. The worst pain doesn't come from the enemy's stab. It comes from the betrayal of those we call friends. It comes from the contempt of those we loved with all our hearts. That night, I waited for him to come back. When he arrived, he pretended nothing had happened. He said goodnight to me as if it were any other day. I took a deep breath and said just one sentence. I saw everything. He turned pale. For the first time, I saw in his eyes a fear he had never shown before. But at that moment, I was no longer afraid. I was tired of pretending to be happy. I was tired of lying to myself. And on that bench where you were sitting, I cried all the tears I had been holding back. Because sometimes life makes us learn through pain what we didn't want to see in love. On the day I married your grandfather, I woke up before the rooster crowed. My heart was so hurried it felt like it could not fit inside my chest. I had spent the entire night thinking about what married life would be like, how it would feel to wake up and see that face so close to mine every single morning. In those times, getting married was more than a commitment of love. It was a pact of honor, of sustenance, of the future itself. I felt such a deep pride in knowing I was ready to build my home, my family, my destiny, all by his side. My mother got up with me. She looked at me with eyes full of tenderness and a bit of sadness at the same time. I have always thought that deep down, every mother feels she is losing a piece of herself when her daughter leaves the house to start a life of her own. But she did not say any words of lament. She only helped me put on my white dress, the one she herself had sewn. It was simple, but I thought it was the most beautiful thing in the world. The fabric was delicate, bought with much sacrifice. I remember she saved each little coin inside an old kerosene can she kept on the back shelf. When she finally had enough money, we walked to the shop in town to buy the cloth. It felt as though I was going to fetch a treasure, and in truth, it was. That dress was my symbol of a beginning, of purity, of hope. While I was getting ready, my father sat on the edge of the bed, running his hand over his white beard, deep in thought. He was a man of few words, but that morning, before I left, he stood up, put his hand on my shoulder, and told me that I was the most honorable daughter he could have wished for, and that he hoped I would be happy, whatever happened. I have never forgotten that moment. The weight of his hand was the weight of the blessing he was giving me. It was as if he were saying, without speaking, that I could go on, that I was ready. The little church stood up there on the hilltop, and everyone in the village came to see. The bell tolled slowly, echoing through the valley. I walked there on foot, carrying the bouquet my godmother had made with wildflowers and some white ribbons left over from my trousseau. As I walked, I could feel every gaze upon me. But the only eyes I searched for were his. When I reached the church door, I saw he was already waiting, dressed in a dark suit, holding his hat against his chest. He looked nervous, but when our eyes met, he smiled. That smile gave me courage. Right then, in that moment, I felt certain that no matter what came, I had chosen that man, and I would not turn back. The ceremony was beautiful, even though it was simple. The pastor was a man respected by everyone, known for having a firm word and a kind heart. He spoke to us about the importance of patience, respect, and fidelity. I listened to everything as if it were a lullaby. So soft was the joy I felt. When it came time to exchange vows, my voice trembled. I promised I would be faithful, that I would care for him in sickness and in health, that I would make our home a place of peace, and he swore the same. When he slipped the ring onto my finger, I felt that golden band was like a seal, closing around all of my dreams. After the wedding, we had a meal at my parents' house. It was all very simple, but full of affection. The women brought platters of food, and the men sat around in the yard telling old stories. He and I stayed in a corner, hardly believing it was finally real. I remember looking down at our hands joined together and thinking that this must be what happiness feels like, calm, gentle, with no hurry to end. When the sun began to set, we said our goodbyes and walked to our new home. It was a little wooden house he had finished building with the help of some friends. The floor still smelled of fresh paint. I did not mind. That house was our entire world. Inside it, there was no room for fear or doubt. That first night, I hung my dress behind the door as if it were a charm, and I lay down next to him. I could hear his heart beating fast, just like mine. We embraced, and for the first time, I called him my husband. He smiled and told me I was everything he had ever wanted. I believed him, and I fell asleep certain that we had an entire life ahead of us. The first months of marriage were so sweet they felt like a dream. Every morning, he left to work in the fields, and I stayed behind to tend the house. I would wash clothes in the basin in the yard, singing softly to make the time pass faster until he came home again. When he arrived, he would bring me fruit or a piece of brown sugar wrapped in a cloth. It was his way of telling me he thought of me all day, and I was happy for any little gesture, no matter how small. I felt like the luckiest woman in the world because I had found a companion who seemed to truly care for me. On cold nights, we sat together by the wood stove, talking about everything and nothing. He liked to tell stories about when he was a boy, how he used to help his father in the fields. I listened to every word because I wanted to know every little piece of his life. Sometimes he would run his hand through my hair and say he had never imagined he would have a wife so devoted. I would smile and feel a warmth in my chest, a gratitude so big it could not be named. In those days, I believed that love was enough, that if we were honest and hardworking, everything would turn out right. I did not know how easily a human heart can go astray. I did not know that even when we give everything of ourselves, the other can still choose betrayal. But at the beginning, I was not afraid of anything. I had faith, I had hope, and I held the sweet illusion that nothing could ever come between us. Married life settled itself quickly, as if everything found its rightful place without effort. When you have little, life is simpler. The house was small, only 2 rooms and a kitchen with a wood stove that smoked from dawn until nightfall. Even so, to me, it was a palace. I woke early, before the sky grew light, and set the kettle on the fire. The smell of coffee was the first sign that the day had begun. While he left for the fields, I swept the yard, fed the hens, and brushed away the dust that insisted on creeping in through the door. But among all the parts of my routine, Sunday was the day I looked forward to the most. That was when we dressed nicely to go to church. I would prepare my blue cotton skirt and tie the scarf over my hair, pulling it smooth so I would not look careless. He wore the white shirt he saved for important occasions. When we left the house together, I felt proud to walk beside him. I believed we were respected, that our life was honorable. In my heart, I thanked God for all of it. I did not need luxury or praise, just that peace I believed was real. The church stood high on the hill, its white front already peeling a little with age. The bell was heavy and rang in a slow, patient call that carried across the valley. I loved that sound. It reminded me that there was a place where everyone was equal. Inside, the pew at the back was always mine, where I sat with the other women who helped in the kitchen and with preparing communion. Before the service, we gathered behind the main hall, around a long table full of aluminum basins. There, we washed dishes, sorted cutlery, arranged the bread each family brought. That work pleased me, because I felt I was serving something greater than my own life. The pastor was a man who spoke calmly, always choosing words that comforted. He had the way of one who listens without judging. His wife, Dona Alzira, was different. She was all polite manners, smiling, always praising the young women, drawing attention with that air of someone who seemed above the others but still claimed we were all brothers and sisters. In my innocence, I liked her. When she came over to ask about my husband, I thought it was only kindness. She would say he was so helpful, always aiding with church matters, that I should be proud to have such a devout man. I smiled without suspecting anything. To me, her words sounded sincere. Never did I imagine she had another purpose. Sundays were not only for the service and work. After the sermon, there were always visits. It was the custom for the families to take turns, hosting the pastor and his wife for lunch. They would sit at our table, accept our coffee, eat the cakes we had prepared with such care. When it was our turn to welcome them, I spent the whole week getting ready. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, spread my best cloth over the table, picked the finest beans, and saved the meat I had been keeping for a special day. Your grandfather said I did not need so much fuss, but to me, that moment was important. It was my way of honoring the house where I lived. At first, everything seemed ordinary. Donna Alzira and I spoke as two acquaintances who respected each other. She praised my cooking, said my house was well kept, commented that my husband often spoke of me with affection. I was glad, feeling my effort was seen. He seemed content too, always so obliging, carrying things from their cart, helping to arrange the chairs outside. I thought it was all goodwill. I had been raised to believe the best of people. Never did I suspect all that attention hid something else. After lunch, often the pastor and she stayed on the porch talking with him. I would gather the dishes, mind the kitchen, and leave the three of them alone. From a distance, I heard their laughter. It was usual for them to discuss church matters, problems of families who needed advice. I respected that. I thought it my duty to give them space. In my mind, if I was a careful wife, there was no reason to doubt. And so, in that routine of meetings and visits, the bond between them grew closer, without my seeing it. I remember an afternoon when I had to leave before the meal ended. My neighbor came to fetch me because one of the hens had hurt itself, and I had to see what could be done. When I returned, I found Donna Alzira alone on the porch. She smiled and said, "My husband had gone to help the pastor settle something at the church." I asked nothing. To me, it was all natural. If I had looked carefully at the way she lowered her eyes while she spoke, maybe my heart would have woken. But I saw nothing. I believed in them as if believing in a brother's word. Every Sunday seemed the same as the one before. The same rituals, the same greetings, the same trust I placed in them. That was how routine became habit, and habit became an opening. I did not know my goodwill was feeding a lie. I could never have imagined that in those visits, so full of apparent devotion, there was something that would one day bring me the greatest pain of my life. The first signs that something was out of place came slowly, like someone arriving on tiptoe so as not to startle me. It was so gradual that, for a long time, I preferred to think it was nothing but nonsense in my own head, those whims of a woman who spends too many hours alone at home. I kept convincing myself there was no reason at all to feel suspicious. But the heart, my dear, the heart has a way of knowing what we do not want to admit. It was on a Sunday, like so many others, that I noticed the first difference. The sermon had ended, the families were already saying their farewells, and I realized he was taking longer than usual to talk with the pastor and Donna Alzira. I stood waiting outside, near the rose bushes that bordered the entrance to the church. I could see the two of them leaning over a notebook, pointing at something, speaking in low voices. When he finally came out, he looked nervous. I asked if something had happened, and he said no, that it was only congregational matters. I wanted to believe him. After all, he had never given me a reason not to trust him. But after that day, nothing seemed quite the same. He began coming home later. I would prepare supper and leave the lamp burning until nearly bedtime. When he came in, it was always with the same explanation, that he had stayed to help settle church issues, that the pastor needed him. I accepted this in silence. I thought being a wife also meant knowing how to be patient. But inside me, something was starting to ache like a thorn under the skin. The neighbors noticed before I did. One day, Donna Selina, who lived on the neighboring farm, came over bringing some collard greens and casually mentioned she had seen him talking to Donna Alzira near the church gate after everyone else had already left. She said this with that curious tone, as if she did not want to meddle, but also could not keep quiet. I felt my face grow hot, as if I had been caught doing something wrong. I thanked her for the greens and changed the subject. When she left, I stayed sitting on the porch bench, staring out over the empty yard. I asked myself whether I was being naive, whether everyone else could see something I refused to see. That night, when he came home, I was quiet. He noticed at once that something was strange. He asked if I was sick, if something had happened. I said no, that I was only tired. He looked at me for a long time, as if he were trying to guess what was in my thoughts. Then he went to wash his hands and sat down to eat. While he chewed slowly, I watched his movements, searching for any sign that would confirm my fears. But there was nothing. The same serious face, the same calm voice. Maybe that was what confused me most. If he had come home laughing too much or refused to look me in the eye, it would have been easier to face the truth. But he behaved as always, and that made me wonder if I was only a suspicious woman without any cause. The days went on in that uncomfortable rhythm. Each Sunday, he stayed away longer. Each visit to the church, I felt an anxiety growing inside me that I did not know how to name. When we came home, he hardly spoke. He would say he was tired, that he had many worries. I offered to help, asked if there was something I could do, but he told me it was better if I did not get involved. So I kept silent, thinking it was my duty to respect his space. One afternoon, I decided I would go early to the church to see with my own eyes what held him there so late. I left home without telling anyone, saying only that I was going to visit a neighbor. When I arrived, I saw the gate standing half open. I went in slowly, my heart beating in my chest like a drum. I walked around the main hall and heard voices coming from the back. It was the two of them, sitting very close to each other, speaking in voices too low for it to be just church business. I could not hear what they were saying. I stood frozen, my hands cold, feeling that in that instant, my entire life was changing color. When I took a step, the floorboard creaked, and they both turned to look at me at the same time. She smiled. He grew serious, almost pale. I said nothing. I simply turned my back and walked away, with the certainty that I would never sleep in peace again. After that day when I saw the two of them sitting together, my life knew no peace. No matter how I tried, I could not erase from my memory the sight of them leaning close, speaking in that tone only people with intimacy use. I would wake in the middle of the night, with my heart racing, feeling as if I had been startled from a nightmare. When he came to lie down beside me, I pretended to be asleep, because I no longer knew how to look into his face. So many times I asked myself if it was just my imagination, if I was exaggerating, if perhaps it was nothing but friendship. But it was enough to remember the way he lowered his head when he saw me, to be certain that no friendship made a man act like that. The days went by, but the wound did not heal. On the contrary, it took root. Everything that once was peaceful became a reason for suspicion. When he said he was going to the fields, I would stand by the window, trying to guess whether he would not turn down another path. When he told me he was going to the shop to buy salt or kerosene, he would stay away so long that my stomach would grow uneasy. And even when he returned with his hands full of parcels, I could not believe that was the whole truth. I began to measure every gesture, every word. That was the time when I came to know the bitter taste of doubt, which settles inside a person like an illness. Even so, I continued to fulfill my duties. I cooked the meals, washed the clothes, tended the chickens as if nothing had happened. I did not want the neighbors to see my sadness. In those days, a woman's reputation was worth everything, and a wife who could not keep her marriage together was seen as a failure. So I pressed my lips shut, tied on my apron, and pretended that everything was in order. Only God knew the weight I carried in my chest. I also began to watch Donna Alzira more closely. When I met her at church, I felt a discomfort that had never been there before. She kept smiling, embracing me as if we were sisters, but I could no longer return the gesture the same way. I wondered what kind of woman was capable of pretending such goodness while she stole someone else's affection. There were moments when I wanted to tear that mask from her face, to shout before everyone that I knew the truth, but I did not have the courage. I lacked the strength to face the scandal that would come afterward. When he noticed my silence, he would ask what was wrong. I would say it was nothing. He insisted, and I said I was tired. So many times he tried to embrace me, and I stiffened my body as if my heart had closed itself from within. He pretended not to notice, or perhaps he did not want to see. And so we went on living, day after day, like two strangers sharing the same roof. There was one Sunday when I almost told everything. I woke determined to put an end to that farce. I prepared the coffee, dressed in my skirt, and thought, today I will speak, whatever may happen. But when I looked at his face, my courage abandoned me. It was as if part of me still wished to believe that everything could return to the way it had been. That was the day I understood that suspicion is like a thorn. The longer it stays buried, the harder it is to pull out. And even if we manage to remove it, the wound remains forever. I believe that deep down, my heart already knew, but a part of me kept clinging to that foolish hope that it was all just a misunderstanding. Perhaps it was easier to live deceived than to face the pain I knew was coming. But there comes a moment when the truth forces itself in, no matter how much we cover our ears. And the day of my discovery came quietly, like a wind that starts soft and, before you realize it, knocks everything down along its path. It was on a Monday afternoon. I had gone out early to take some corn to Donna Selina, who was struggling with a weak field. On the way back, walking along the dusty little road, my heart was calmer than it had been in weeks. I had spent so many days brooding over suspicion, but that day, by some whim of God, I decided I would not think about sadness. I only wanted to come home, light my stove, and pretend life was still good. But when I turned the bend near the church, I saw the pastor's car parked by the side gate. It already struck me as strange, because it was not time for a meeting or a visit. I felt my chest tighten. Even so, I walked up to the fence slowly, trying to find an explanation. Perhaps they were just having a conversation, I told myself. But my steps grew slower, as if my legs already knew I ought not to go any closer. I set my hand against the gatepost and heard laughter. It was her laughter, a sound I knew well, the same that had greeted me so many times with false sweetness. Then I heard his voice. It was not the serious tone he used when discussing church matters. It was a way of speaking I had never heard in our house, a soft, laughing whisper, as if no one else in the world existed but the two of them. My hands began to tremble. I even tried to step back, to turn around and pretend I had seen nothing. But some force greater than me pushed me forward. I took a few more steps, and when I looked through the crack in the door left ajar, I saw what my heart had feared. There inside, pressed into a shadowed corner, were he and Donna Alzira, the two of them in an embrace, like sweethearts. His arm was wrapped around her waist, and she had her face resting on his chest. Neither of them seemed concerned about hiding. It was as if everything had already become natural, as if that were the place they belonged. I stood there frozen, not breathing. I was afraid I might faint. The ground seemed to pull away from under my feet. I do not know how long I stood staring at that scene. Perhaps it was only a few seconds, but for me, it was an eternity. I remembered the day of my wedding, the promise he made, all that I had given of myself. I thought of all the nights I had waited for him to come home, believing he was fulfilling a sacred duty. In that instant, I felt my heart break for real. It was as if something inside me died. When I finally managed to take a step back, the door creaked. They turned to look at me together. His eyes met mine, and it was as though the world stood still. There was no excuse that could fit in that moment, no word that could undo what I had seen. She tried to smile, but I no longer had the strength to hear anything that came from that mouth. I only lowered my eyes and walked away, feeling my body so light it seemed I no longer belonged in their lives. The road back felt endless. I walked without looking to either side. I felt the afternoon collapse onto me, heavy and silent. When I reached home, I closed the door, let my scarf fall on the table, and sat down on the bench without crying. It was as though I had already wept everything inside me over all those years. I stayed there until night came, thinking how my story had turned into such a great deception. That night, he did not return early. I was not surprised. There was nothing left to explain. When I heard the sound of his steps on the porch, my chest did not leap. I only felt an emptiness that had no bottom. He came in slowly, perhaps expecting that I would ask where he had been. But I said nothing. I simply raised my face and spoke. I saw everything. Those were 3 words, nothing more, but they carried all the pain in the world. His face turned pale. For an instant, I saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of losing me, fear of the shame, fear of the judgment from those who once trusted him. I did not cry. I did not scream. I only looked at him, waiting for him to say anything at all that might justify that crime against my heart. But he said nothing, and in that silence, I understood that everything was over. That night, after he came in and heard the words I had spoken, the house sank into a silence I had never felt before. It was not the silence of the small hours, nor the silence of peace. It was a heavy silence that sat at the table with us, that filled every corner of the bedroom, that clung to the skin. He remained standing, as if he did not know whether he ought to come closer or leave for good. I did not move either. It was as though my soul had slipped out of my body and left me sitting there with nothing but emptiness. I do not remember how long we stayed like that. Perhaps it was only a few minutes, but the pain made it feel like an eternity. Inside my mind, every scene of our marriage played like an old film. The little white church, the bouquet of wildflowers, the ring shining on my finger. All those things I had believed in suddenly seemed worthless. I kept thinking, how does such a beautiful story end like this? Where did I go wrong? But some part of me already knew it was not my fault. No matter how we look for reasons, sometimes people simply choose to wound the ones who loved them most. He came closer slowly, as if he were stepping on shards. When he stopped in front of me, he tried to touch my arm. I drew back without speaking. It was not anger I felt at that moment. It was something worse. It was a sorrow so deep it hardly fit inside my chest. I did not know how to go on from there. I did not know whether it was possible to live beside him after what had happened. Everything seemed to have lost its meaning. He tried to speak. He opened his mouth, closed it again, took a deep breath. I did not look at him. I kept my gaze fixed on the floor, on the worn planks of the boards, as if there I might find some answer. When at last he gathered courage, he spoke my name in a whisper. That voice which once brought me comfort now sounded like poison. He said he had never meant it to happen, that things had unfolded without him realizing, that it was a mistake, a weakness. I remained silent. I knew there was no excuse that could wash that away. It was too late for regret. The lamp cast its light on his face, and I saw that he was crying. Perhaps those were sincere tears, perhaps only fear of the shame that would follow. I could not say. By then, I was no longer sure of anything. I kept thinking of everything I had done for him, everything I had sacrificed to keep our home. I had given the best years of my life, and in return, I received lies. When that thought settled in me, the pain grew so great I had to sit down. My vision blurred. The air left my chest. I thought only, God, give me strength not to lose my mind. He knelt down in front of me and tried to take my hands. I drew them back gently, without anger, but with firmness. I did not want him to touch me. I did not want to feel the warmth of his hands, because I knew that if I did, I might betray myself and cry against his shoulder. And I did not want to give that victory to my deceived heart. I needed to hold on to my dignity, even if by a single thread. So I stayed there, sitting, breathing deep, holding inside me all the words I longed to scream. After a time, he stood up. He said he would sleep at his brother's house until I decided what I wanted to do. I only nodded. When he went out and closed the door, an even greater silence filled the house. I thought I would collapse, but I did not cry. I walked to the bed, sat on the edge, and stared at the wall. The whole night passed that way. I could not lie down. I could not close my eyes. I spent hours thinking how love can turn into the worst punishment. At dawn, I felt that the world had fallen upon me. But even buried under all that pain, I knew that somehow, someday, I would stand up again. I did not know when. I did not know how. But there, in that sleepless dawn without tears, I promised I would not let that betrayal destroy me completely. When morning came, I was still sitting in the same place. The lamp had already gone out, and the light coming through the crack in the window made it seem as though everything had been a bad dream. But it was not. His absence in the house proved it was real, that my life had changed forever. I did not know exactly what to do. I had no desire to get up, but I also did not want to remain there, brooding over the same pain. So I rose slowly, washed my face, and forced myself to prepare coffee. Perhaps it was a way to prove to myself that I was still alive. The neighbors began to appear, each with a different excuse to come and watch me. Donna Selina came to ask if I needed help with the firewood. Another brought a parcel of bread, saying she had extra from her baking. I could see in their eyes the curiosity, the pity, the hunger to know every detail, but I told them nothing. I only thanked them and said everything was under control. Inside me, though, I knew it was not. I felt that any moment my chest might split open and let all that suffering fall onto the floor. In the middle of the afternoon, I heard footsteps coming up to the gate. My heart leapt, whether I wanted it or not. When I lifted my eyes, I saw it was him. He was walking slowly, his hands buried in his pockets, his face drawn. For an instant, I thought of going inside and shutting the door, but something made me stay. I wanted him to see that I had not run away, that I would not hide from the shame he had brought into our home. He stopped at the edge of the yard and looked at me, as if asking permission to come closer. I said nothing. I waited for him to take the first step. After some time, he came up onto the porch and took off his hat, in a gesture of respect that felt so false it turned my stomach. We stood there, face to face, not knowing who would speak first. At last, he took a deep breath and said my name. His voice was hoarse. He said he needed to explain. I raised my hand slowly, telling him to be silent. I did not want to hear excuses because no words could change what I had seen. He insisted, saying it was not simple, that things had happened in a way he himself did not understand. I felt a cold anger then. An indignation I did not know lived inside me. I asked if he had thought of me when he held that woman. I asked if he remembered the promises he had made before God and the entire congregation. He lowered his head and said nothing. In that silence, my pain became certainty. He no longer loved me. I told him he had destroyed everything we had built, that our story was now stained forever. I spoke everything calmly, without crying, without shouting. It was the first time I felt I had regained a little of my dignity. He raised his eyes and tried to come nearer to touch me, but I stepped back. I needed to keep that distance. I needed him to understand there was no easy return from what he had done. After a long silence, he asked what I wanted him to do. I had no ready answer. A part of me wanted him to leave and never come back. Another part wanted him to stay there on his knees, begging forgiveness for the rest of his life. But I knew none of that would ever bring peace back to my heart. So I only said I did not know, that I needed time to decide if it was still possible to live beside him. He nodded. He said he would respect my time. When he turned to leave, my legs almost gave way. I nearly called him back. I almost asked him to stay, to hold me as he used to. But I drew a deep breath and remained still, because in that moment, I understood that love cannot survive on memories alone, and that dignity is not something to be bargained for, not even out of fear of ending up alone. After he left, the house grew so silent it hurt my ears. I stayed there on the porch, my heart beating slowly, as if it too was tired of so much suffering. The sun was already starting to slip behind the hill when I heard voices on the path. I did not have to look to know that the news had spread quickly. In that little place, any whisper became everyone's business. It only took a pair of curious eyes for the story to catch like wildfire. The next day, when I went to fetch water from the well, I felt all the eyes upon me. Some women lowered their heads as I passed, as if my sorrow were contagious. Others stared with pity. There were those who came closer to ask, in that sweet tone that pretends compassion, "Are you all right? If you need anything, you can count on me." I smiled without showing my teeth, thanked them, and walked on, because I knew that as soon as I turned my back, they would huddle together and start to repeat every detail they imagined. I had seen it happen to other women. I never thought it would be my turn one day. The men whispered too. When he walked along the road, I noticed some of them turned their eyes away, while others made a point of greeting him, as if to show whose side they were on, perhaps out of friendship, perhaps out of fear of meddling. And so, little by little, I realized that more than the betrayal itself, what hurt most was the tongues of the people. You are already suffering inside, but you still must endure the judgment of those who think they have the right to speak about your life. The pastor pretended he knew nothing. He went on preaching his sermons on Sundays, speaking of forgiveness and righteousness. Donna Alzira did not change either. She arrived at church with that wide smile, greeting everyone as though she were the most saintly woman in the world. When she crossed paths with me, she would lower her eyes a little, but soon lifted her chin again. I thought that perhaps to her it was nothing more than another passing affair, and that hurt even more, because for me, it was the end of my story. For her, it seemed only a whim. Some people told me I should forgive, that marriage was like that, full of ups and downs. A neighbor even confided that she preferred to pretend not to see her husband's wandering, because she thought being alone was worse. I listened in silence, but inside, I knew I did not have the strength to accept it as something normal. I had been raised to believe that respect came before everything, and even if it would cost me loneliness, I was not about to give up my dignity. Weeks passed, and every Sunday became a trial. I woke early, put on my clean clothes, and went to church. Not because I wished to, but because I felt that if I stopped going, I would be giving victory to those who were eager to see me defeated. I walked with my head held high, even though inside I wished I could vanish. Every step was an effort to prove to myself that I could be stronger than shame. During communion, my hands would tremble. When the pastor spoke about the purity of the heart, I felt a pang that made me want to run away. But I stayed there, sitting on my bench, breathing deeply, because I knew the only way not to lose myself entirely was to keep going, even if it hurt. Some admired me for it. I could see it in their eyes. Others thought I was too proud. But no one knew the size of the battle I was fighting inside. What held me up in that time was remembering who I was before all of it. I was not only a betrayed woman, I was the daughter of honorable people. I had a story, a strength that came from far back, and I repeated that to myself every morning before leaving the house, because I knew that if I let the judgment of others define me, I would never again be who I had been. Time passed slowly, as though each day had twice as many hours. The pain did not disappear suddenly, nor did it go away all at once. It was changing. At first, it was an open wound, throbbing with every memory. Later, it became a scar that hurt only when someone touched it carelessly. Even so, I discovered it was possible to keep living. In the first months, I woke up without any desire to get out of bed. I thought about all I had lost, about everything I had dreamed that would never come to pass. The image of the two of them together came back to my mind like an unwelcome visitor. Sometimes I closed my eyes and asked God to erase it from my memory. But life does not work like that. We do not choose what to remember. We can only choose what to do with what remains. Little by little, I began to find small sources of strength, tiny things that helped me not to give up. The crowing of the rooster reminded me the day needed to be lived, whether I wished it or not. The smell of fresh coffee gave me the courage to rise and do my chores. The faces of the neighbors who looked at me with respect, even though some also judged me, gave me spirit to keep going. I clung to these scraps of normalcy like someone holding onto a plank in the middle of a river. One day, I realized I no longer cried every night. That was when I understood the pain was moving somewhere else. It no longer weighed as heavily in my chest. It was as if it had settled into a corner of my heart, quiet, waiting for its moment to ache again. But meanwhile, I could breathe without sobbing. I could pass a whole afternoon without remembering everything I had lost. I began sewing for others because I needed to keep my mind occupied and earn some money. The orders came little by little. First, there were dish towels. Later, a neighbor asked me to make her a dress for Sunday service. I spent hours with the needle in my hand, and in the back and forth of every stitch, I found a little piece. When I was sitting in that chair, with the cloth on my lap, I felt I still had worth. I might have been betrayed, but I was still a woman capable of creating something beautiful with her own hands. That was how I began to rebuild my life, without haste, without grand plans. I did not know if my heart would ever trust again, but I no longer felt any rush to find out. For the first time in many years, I began to enjoy my own company. I learned how to sit in silence without feeling empty. I learned that dignity is refusing to beg for anyone's love. When he came back to say he wanted to try again, I was no longer the same woman. He stepped into the room with that downcast look, saying he was sorry, that it had been foolishness, a weakness. I listened to everything in silence. When he finished speaking, I thanked him for his honesty, but told him I could not accept. I knew that story would always be between us like a shadow, and I did not want to live in the shadow of anything or anyone. Some said I was too proud, that a decent woman forgives. I listened to every opinion without letting it shake me, because only I knew what it cost to keep my head held high. Only I knew the price one pays for refusing to sell oneself out of fear of loneliness. And deep down, I was not alone. I had my courage, I had my story, I had my faith, and although everything had fallen apart, I was still standing. That was how I learned that a person can lose almost everything and still remain whole. Not because forgetting is easy, but because after you have survived the worst, you learn to recognize your own worth. I was not only the woman who was betrayed, I was the woman who survived. Today, when I look back, I no longer feel that pain that once pressed down on my chest until I could scarcely breathe. What remains is a strange kind of longing, mixed with gratitude, not longing for him, nor for that time that ended in the worst way, but longing for the woman I was before it all happened, the one who believed that love could save anything, who swore that it was enough to be good and generous to receive the same care in return. I had to lose my certainties to learn that the world does not work that way. If someone were to ask me what I learned from this story, I would say the greatest lesson was realizing we cannot control anyone's heart. We can give the best of ourselves, we can be loyal down to the last hair on our heads, and still there is no guarantee of anything. Whoever wants to betray will betray. Whoever wants to deceive will deceive. And there is no use blaming yourself, because it is not a lack of your worth. It is a lack of their shame. I also learned that dignity is not something you can buy or borrow. Dignity is born in the silence of your own conscience, in that moment when you choose not to humiliate yourself. And as hard as it may be, lifting your head after a disappointment is the only way not to lose what is left of who you are. With time, I understood that if he had not hurt me in that way, perhaps I never would have discovered my strength. Perhaps I would have spent my whole life believing I needed him to be someone. But God, in his wisdom, allowed the mask to fall. It was a suffering that tore me apart, but it also taught me. Today, I know that we are not defined by what others do to us, but by what we choose to do after everything collapses. I chose to go on. I chose not to poison myself with hatred. I will not deny there were days when I wished he would feel the same pain he caused me. But later, I understood that carrying resentment only prolongs the prison. And I did not want to live locked up in the past. I wanted to be free to wake up and feel proud of myself. And that freedom was the greatest victory I ever gained. When I speak of it now, it is not to win anyone's pity. It is to remind that life can turn in ways nobody expects, and that no woman deserves to feel she is less because of someone else's betrayal. If you ever go through something like this, if your world falls apart without warning, I want you to remember my story. I want you to know that it hurts, that it feels like it will never pass, but it does pass. And when it does, you become someone that nobody can ever bring down again. That is the lesson that remains. I am not the naive girl who walked into the little white church wearing a wedding dress, thinking love was enough. I am the woman who came out the other side of the pain hole, perhaps a little more serious, a little more cautious, but much stronger. I am the woman who chose not to give up on herself. If you liked Grandma's story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can hear more stories like this and share them with other people who might be inspired by this story of overcoming. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been in a similar situation? How did you react? A kiss on the heart from all of you, and until the next story.